England, 12th century. Two children appear in a remote village with the gloomy name of Wulpit. They do not speak human language. Their skin is green. They are afraid of bread and drink only juice from pods. One dies, and the other tells the story of how they came from a land where the sun never shines. Who are they? Victims of famine? Inhabitants of an underground world? Aliens? Or forgotten descendants of a lost civilization? This is a story that no one has ever been able to explain. 12th century, England, a land of kings and crusaders, monasteries and knights, castles and huts. A world where the lines between life and death, faith and fear, reality and legend were much thinner than they are today. It was an era when the land belonged to lords, souls to the church, and minds to God knows who. At that time, the kingdom lived at the crossroads of faith and horror. After the Norman conquest, England remained divided and troubled. The branches of power stretched between the crown, the Roman Church, and the local barons. The countryside was full of marauders, rebels, refugees, and wanderers. The forests seemed impenetrable, and the marshy valleys were like portals to another world. It was in this dark, half-forgotten corner of history that one of the most inexplicable events of medieval Europe unfolded. An event recorded not by hearsay or myth, but by chronicles. It was described by two monks, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, both respected chroniclers of their time. The first was a historian and canon from North Yorkshire, the second a monk from Coggeshall Abbey in Essex. Their works are now considered some of the most important sources on the history of 12th century England. Neither of them was inclined to embellish the truth. On the contrary, both were renowned for their desire to separate fact from fiction. And yet, independently of each other, they both recorded the story of two green-skinned children who appeared in the village of Wulpit in Suffolk. What exactly did they write? Why has this story survived, even though no similar cases have ever been recorded? It is important to understand the context. In medieval England, miracles were not uncommon. They were perceived not as a violation of order, but as its confirmation. The world was magical by definition. Belief in the existence of other worlds, dark forest peoples, underground dwellers, and people of a different blood was not considered heresy. On the contrary, it fit into the Christian worldview. Against this backdrop, the appearance of children who did not speak the known language, were afraid of bread, and had an unnatural green skin tone was perceived not simply as a miracle, but as a sign, like a message from another, darker, more ancient world. And it was here, in a village whose name can be translated as Wulpit, that it all began. The story of the green-skinned children begins without warning. According to the chronicle, on one warm day, possibly in the summer, two children appeared on the outskirts of the village of Wulpit, a boy and a girl. They were discovered by local peasants who were probably working in the fields. They noticed movement at the entrance to a deep ravine, from where the children seemed to have emerged. What they saw was so unusual that even in a century of superstition, it caused confusion. The children were dressed in strange clothes, not ragged, but rather foreign, with unusual cuts and fabrics. But the main thing was different. Their skin was green. Not just dark or covered with a crust of disease. It was green, like grass, like young leaves. They spoke to each other, but in a language that no one understood. None of the dialects known at the time, Anglo-Norman, Saxon, or Latin, matched. Their speech seemed inhuman, according to eyewitnesses, mumbling, fast, like birds. Overcome with curiosity and fear, the peasants took the children to the village. First, they took them to the village elder, and then, when it became clear that this was no ordinary occurrence, they took them to the local lord, Sir Richard de Calais, a vassal of the Bishop of Ely. It was he who took the strange children into his estate, where they were treated as strangers, not prisoners, but not equals either. The chronicler, Ralph of Coggeshall, writing several decades after the events, notes that the children refused all food offered to them. They were brought bread, meat, vegetables. They turned away, not recognizing or understanding. Only when someone accidentally brought them green beans in pods did the children begin to eat them with enthusiasm. And they continued to eat only this for many days. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of these details. Refusal to eat is one of the classic signs of different origins in folklore. So are strange speech and unusual skin color. From this point of view, the children from Wulpit literally match the archetype of guests from another world. William of Neuburg, in turn, recounts this story in a more skeptical tone. He notes that, despite the improbability of the story, it was repeated by too many reliable witnesses to be simply dismissed. He also clarifies that the children did not look wild, but rather frightened and confused. They clung to each other, especially the boy to his sister, and suffered greatly during the first few days, not understanding where they were. Interestingly, none of the chroniclers describe the moment of the arrival itself. The children seem to have simply emerged from a ravine, which in itself gives rise to numerous versions. Some later authors see this as an indication of tribal youth. Underground origins. Others as a hidden refuge or portal. Later, when the children began to understand the local language a little, and the girl began to learn English, she told her version of their origin. But before we move on to that, we need to understand what happened to them in the first weeks after their appearance, how they changed, and what observations were made by those who lived with them. This will lead us to the next chapter, about behavior, language, food, and first contact with the outside world. The first weeks spent at Sir Richard de Calais' estate were crucial in understanding who these children were. At first, they kept to themselves. The younger of the two boys clearly looked to his older sister for guidance. He constantly sought physical contact, holding her hand and hiding behind her. The girl, on the other hand, was cautiously but persistently curious. She looked around at her surroundings, tried to touch objects, and listened to sounds. They did not speak, or spoke only to each other, in a language that no one could understand. According to recollections, it sounded like the murmur of a spring, but with a broken rhythm. Some contemporaries even considered it not speech, but inhuman babbling. Similar to birdsong or the sound of a flute, this reinforced the impression that the children had not come from somewhere, but from nowhere. At first, their refusal to eat caused alarm. The children were fed everything that was in the house: soups, porridge, bread, meat. But they either pushed the food away or sat silently, not touching it. It was even thought that they might be bewitched or in need of purification. Only when they were given green beans in pods in a bowl, possibly prepared for animals, did the children enthusiastically pounce on them and eat them whole, without even removing the beans. From that moment on, food preferences became the key. The children ate only things that resembled green plants. Boiled grass, leaves, especially when raw, all inspired their trust. Rumors spread that there was no other food in their country. Moreover, the girl would later say that there is no sun in their land, only eternal twilight, and that all the plants there are green and moist. This explanation would later be embellished with legends about underground kingdoms where everything is illuminated not by light, but by the glow of the earth. As for language, after several weeks and then months in an English-speaking environment, the girl began to learn words. It was a painful process. They say she often cried at night and looked for her brother when his health began to deteriorate. Gradually, however, she mastered English enough to make herself understood. It was from her that chroniclers learned a shocking detail. The children had come from St. Martin's Land. This country, she said, was on the other side of a great river, from where one could hear bells ringing and see a light similar to daylight, but always dim, as if through a thick fog. The children were herding their father's cattle when they suddenly heard a roar and loud ringing, after which they found themselves in this terrible land, as she put it. This story was a turning point. It gave rise to dozens of interpretations. But before we delve into the abyss of hypotheses, we need to understand what happened next, to the children, to their lives, and why everything turned out differently. Everything changed within the first few months. Despite the care, warm food, and safe conditions, the boy began to fade. According to chroniclers, he became lethargic, refused to eat, and did not want to talk, even to his sister. His greenish skin began to fade, but this was accompanied by a decline in strength. He began to cough, slept a lot, and at some point simply stopped getting out of bed. He was cared for with caution, but even experienced nuns could not understand what was happening to him. He died a few weeks after the girl began learning English. The cause of his death was not specified in any of the surviving sources. The chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall mentions it dryly. The boy soon passed away, while William of Newburgh omits the episode altogether. Perhaps they did not want to record a tragedy that no one could explain. Her sister, on the other hand, began to settle in. Her skin gradually became more human in color. Both chroniclers note this fact. Perhaps it was a reaction to the change in diet, or simply physiological recovery after prolonged exhaustion. In any case, the greenish tint disappeared, and at some point she looked almost the same as the other village children. She learned the language, began to understand customs, learned to care for livestock and do housework. According to eyewitnesses, she was a quite ordinary girl, albeit with rough manners and a tendency to be withdrawn. Some considered her sullen, others simply detached. In her maturity, she entered the service of Mairtide Sir Richard de Calais, the very man who had taken her in. Later, according to rumors, she married one of his servants, or possibly even one of his subordinates. Some chronicles claim that her name was Agnes, and that she lived a long life, but no one else from her people ever appeared. Thus, the story became a legend. One girl, one death, one story, and a centuries-old mystery. From this point on, everything we know becomes secondary, interpreted, and confusing. A field of versions and hypotheses begins, in which people try to find the truth. Who were they? Where did they come from? And most importantly, why? The most obvious explanation for the story of the green-skinned children is rational. From the point of view of historians and anthropologists, the phenomenon can be explained by natural causes, without resorting to underground worlds or other realities. And this hypothesis has many supporters. Let's start with the fact that 12th century England was a country not only of kings and knights, but also of nakithi, endless peasant misery. Famine, epidemics, local wars between barons, and internecine skirmishes were all part of everyday life. Particularly vulnerable were wandering families, who had been expelled or resettled from lands seized by large landowners. Migration of the rural population for political or economic reasons was the norm at the time. Suffolk, where Wulpit is located, is close to marshes and borderlands. There is speculation that the children may have been runaways, for example, from a poor, isolated community that spoke an incomprehensible dialect. Their strange language may have been one of the extinct forms of Saxon or Celtic dialects, not understood by the local inhabitants, who had no contact with other regions. With low literacy rates and no schools, language barriers arose even between neighboring villages. As for the greenish skin, a medical hypothesis comes into play. A number of modern researchers have put forward the theory of hypochromic anemia, caused by extreme malnutrition and an unbalanced diet. This is a condition in which the skin becomes pale greenish, especially in the light, due to a lack of iron and vitamins. In children who ate only legumes or root vegetables, these symptoms could be pronounced. There is also a rarer assumption: argyria, the accumulation of silver in body tissues. However, this is unlikely for rural children. The anemia version seems much more realistic. If children were malnourished for a long time, lived in basements, caves, or cellars, and ate only plants, their condition can be easily explained medically. What about the fear of ordinary food? Here again, the cultural context helps. Children who had never seen bread or cooked meat might not have recognized it as food. This is especially true if they grew up in a society with different traditions or in conditions of starvation, where the diet was strictly vegetarian. Add to this possible trauma. If they lost their parents, witnessed violence or a disaster, their behavior could well be the result of the psychological shock. The closeness between brother and sister, their unwillingness to eat, their silence. All these are signs of fear. Supporters of this version believe that the legend of the land of Saint Martin is nothing more than a distorted child's perception of a real place, possibly a monastery or farm where the saint was worshipped and bells rang. And the river they crossed is simply the edge of the forest, transformed in the child's mind into a boundary between worlds. This version is not so romantic, but it brings the story down to earth. And even in this form, it remains gruesome, like the tragedy of children whom no one understood and who came out of nowhere, having lost everything. If the rational explanation seems plausible, the folkloric version is much more deeply ingrained in the consciousness of medieval people. And perhaps it is this that explains why the story of the green-skinned children has survived for 8 centuries, while hundreds of others have disappeared. In traditional English culture, especially in the east of the country, the idea of underworlds is deeply rooted. This is not hell in the Christian sense, but a pure, parallel space where time flows differently, where creatures live by their own laws, and where one can accidentally find oneself and not always return. Numerous legends recorded in later centuries tell of people who disappeared into ravines, forests, and caves, and suddenly returned changed. Sometimes forever. In Celtic tradition, this world was called the Sidhe, the abode of fairies, spirits, and an ancient people who had gone underground. It was said that there was no sun there, only twilight, and a soft glow from stones and plants. This is exactly how the girl from Wulpit described her homeland. Interestingly, green in English folklore is associated not with illness, but with magical creatures. It is the color of the forest, mystery, witches, and fairies. It is no coincidence that green is almost always mentioned in legends about elves and spirits. It is the color of their clothes, skin, and glow. It symbolizes non-human origins. The image of children from another world is found in the folklore of many countries, from Ireland to Eastern Europe. These children are often saptafim, substitutes, beings left behind by fairies in place of stolen human babies. Sometimes they appear on their own, accidentally, through cracks between worlds. They are often described as mute, afraid of bread and salt, and having an unhealthy skin tone. This was also linked to the incident in Wulpit. The village itself, in sound, resembles the word wolf pit, which may be related to the folkloric symbolism of a place where the boundaries between worlds are thin. It was from such a pit that the children emerged. This reinforced the perception of them not as people, but as wantit, aliens from an ancient underground people, who sometimes make themselves known. Even the mention of Nadintointoidain, Saint Martin, does not detract from this version. In Christian England, almost every place was associated with a saint. In myths, therefore, Saint Martin's Land may not have been a real place, but rather an echo of the girl's attempt to describe a folkloric kingdom where others live. Some folklorists believe that the girl was not speaking literally, but in a symbolic language. She was describing a world that does not exist geographically, but lives in the collective memory. A world where children were not supposed to go, but did, and perhaps not of their own free will. Within this version, the story from Wulpit becomes not a medical episode, but a living myth, the only one documented, and therefore unique. Starting in the mid-20th century, when pop culture got really into UFOs, alternative history, and theories about parallel worlds, the story of the green-skinned kids from Wulpit got a new life. Now it is viewed not as folklore or a medical case, but as possible evidence of contact with another dimension. The first version of this theory is Poirifi, alien. According to it, the children were not fugitives or creatures from folk tales, but representatives of Canfiu Dirtiu Anantrai Terthader Tufiu. Another civilization who accidentally or intentionally ended up on Earth. Their green skin color is interpreted not as a disease, but as a biological feature. Their lack of understanding of human language, fear of food, and strange clothing all fit well with the idea of aliens who found themselves in an alien environment. Some ufologists suggest that the children may have been ejected to the surface as a result of a technical error, an accident, or even a deliberate drop-off. In this context, the girl's phrase about a loud noise and a ringing sound after, which they found themselves in a terrible land, is particularly interesting. Some hear in this, albeit metaphorically, a métis toward tidintis. Portal. A tear in space, a transition from one world to another. Another, less cosmic but no less intriguing version is the paritwarns, parallel dimensions. Hypothesis. According to this theory, there are thin zones on Earth where the fabric of space-time is disrupted, and in certain places, such as ravines, swamps, or karst voids, spontaneous transitions between realities are possible. This idea is popular in science fiction and paranormal theories. In this case, the children could have been inhabitants of a world very similar to ours, but different in terms of conditions. No direct sunlight, a different biosphere, and a different atmospheric composition. Perhaps only green food grows in their world, or perhaps the skin of all creatures is adapted to a different environment. And when they fell into the wolf pit, they crossed a border they knew nothing about. For most historians, this interpretation is, of course, unacceptable, but its power lies in its emotional impact. It offers a Bach myth for a new era, where instead of fairies and spirits, there are portals, technology, and extraterrestrial communications. In this sense, the children of Wulpit remain a symbol of contact with the unknown, whatever that may be. The story of the green-skinned children of Wulpit is not just a strange episode from a medieval chronicle. It is a living legend that has inspired writers, researchers, mystics, and philosophers for centuries. It has survived its time because it reflects, like a mirror, the fears, hopes, and secret expectations of humanity. As early as the 16th century, English antiquarians wrote about this case, trying to find a logical explanation. In the 17th century, the story found its way into collections of miraculous events. During the Enlightenment, it was treated with irony, but people still continued to retell it. In the 20th century, with the growing interest in folklore and paranormal phenomena, the story of the children from Wulpit gained a second wind. It was included in anthologies of mysteries, paradoxes, and anomalous cases. Authors were particularly active in the 1960s and 1970s, when, on the wave of interest in UFOs and ancient mysteries, this story began to be seen as a panoriti, possible case of contact with the unknown. It inspired novelists. For example, British writer Herbert Reed dedicated a novella to the story of the children. In 20th century fantasy literature, there are several stories about children with different skin, found on the border between civilizations. The plot clearly goes back to Wulpit. Visual art also did not ignore this legend. Contemporary artists, illustrators, and graphic designers depicted green children as sad aliens, mysterious creatures from the forest, symbols of loss and otherness, sometimes as a warning. Even in the 21st century, new theories are emerging. Some see them as a metaphor for the integration of outsiders, migrants, those whom society does not accept. Some see them as an archetype of a lost paradise that has remained forever on the other side of the river. Some see them as a tragedy of loneliness in a world where no one speaks your language. And the village of Wulpit itself? It still exists, a quiet place in Suffolk, where time seems to have stood still. There is a memorial sign, and local schools tell children the old legend. But if you ask a local resident if they believe it, they will most likely just smile, because it's not about whether the story is literally true. It's about the fact that it's alive. And like any living legend, it continues to ask questions and leaves us without answers.